Welcome, weary traveler of thought, to another slow unraveling of forgotten history, a tale best listened to under warm blankets, with eyes growing heavy. If you enjoy drifting through strange and sometimes uncomfortable truths about the past, make sure to gently press that like button and subscribe so you never miss another curious chapter. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? What part of the world do you call home tonight? I'd love to know, so please, leave it in the comments down below. Now let us descend into one of the most peculiar, least glamorous, but undeniably human corners of our shared story. The long, winding, often bizarre tale of what people did before toilet paper. Because while civilizations rose and fell, while emperors ruled and peasants toiled, one simple biological reality never changed. Every single person, from the most gilded monarch to the humblest servant, had to clean themselves after relieving their bowels. And how they did it tells us more than you might imagine about hygiene, culture, shame, ingenuity, and even survival. Long before the concept of toilet paper floated gently into our modern lives, the earliest humans had to make do with what nature offered. In the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia, along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, people likely used simple plant matter. Broadleaves, grasses, and smooth stones may have done the job. There were no written instructions, no advice columns carved into clay, just instinct, discomfort, and experimentation. What wouldn't give you a rash became the tool of choice. Moving eastward to ancient India, we find a more systematic approach. The concept of cleanliness was deeply tied to spiritual purity. There, water was central cleansing, the body was part of daily ritual, and left hands were used in tandem with water to wash oneself after defecation. This, of course, led to the strict social rule that the left hand should never be used for eating or greeting. Even now, remnants of this practice survive in parts of South Asia and the Middle East, where water remains the primary method of personal hygiene. Ancient China offers some of the earliest recorded mentions of paper for sanitary use. In the 6th century, court officials documented that paper was being used for wiping, but it wasn't toilet paper as we know it. It was large, rough, and made from rice straw or bamboo pulp. Still, it was a leap forward. By the Tang dynasty, the wealthy began to commission softer papers. In the 14th century, records mention the manufacture of 720 sheets of toilet paper for the emperor's family. Each sheet was 2 by 3 feet. That's not a typo. While the emperors of China wiped with luxury, most peasants continued to rely on bamboo splints, smooth stones, or water. In the Greco-Roman world, we enter a chapter of history that is both ingenious and horrifying. Public latrines were common, especially in Rome, where dozens of people could sit side by side over a flowing trench. Beneath their stone seats, water channeled waste away, but wiping? That was done with a tersorium, a sponge attached to a stick. The sponge sat in a bucket of vinegar or salt water. After use, it was rinsed and returned for the next person. There was no individual sponge. The tersorium was communal. One could argue that it brought people together, though not in ways we'd want to replicate. Greek texts also reference the use of pessoa, small rounded stones, or sometimes fragments of broken pottery. These were used much like we might use a cloth or wipe today. Their surfaces were sometimes inscribed with curses aimed at enemies. Wiping with someone's name? It was as literal an insult as could be imagined. Across the Mediterranean and through time, other civilizations found their own methods. In Islamic regions, even early on, the emphasis was always on cleanliness. Water was paramount. The Quran dictated the importance of being clean before prayer, and so devices like the loda, a small water vessel, became common in households. Its descendants are still used today. Meanwhile, in Europe, things took a darker turn. After the fall of the Roman Empire, hygiene practices crumbled alongside aqueducts and civic order. In the early medieval period, people often wiped with straw, moss, hay, or even their own clothing. Garments were scarce and precious, so cleaning rags or reused fabric scraps, often called clouts, became multi-purpose tools of survival. It was not uncommon for peasants to reuse cloth again and again, rinsing it in rivers, drying it by the hearth, then repeating the cycle. In the frigid northern climates, where vegetation was sparse and water froze in the winter, wiping became even more of a challenge. Some used bundles of snow. Others relied on animal pelt strips of fur that could be washed and reused. Sealskin, for instance, was favored by some Norse peoples. In monasteries, monks developed their own procedures. Silence was often part of the rule, so methods of wiping were never openly discussed. But records suggest the use of a gomphis, a personal cloth tucked beneath the habit, reserved for such duties. It would be boiled and reused. At great risk of infection, of course, but there was no alternative. The nobility had slightly better options. Some wiped with lace, linen, or even wool cloth. Castles kept piles of rags for the purpose, and sometimes herbal infusions like lavender or rosemary were added to the water to help with odor. Of course, these were luxuries. For the average subject, bark, leaves, or the edge of a tunic had to suffice. And then, of course, came the outhouse, an invention both liberating and dreadful. A pit beneath a small wooden structure offered privacy and stench in equal measure. The tools available varied: corn cobs, seashells, handfuls of hay. In some parts of Eastern Europe, smooth tiles or bricks were used, then rinsed. In Japan, a tool called chugi, a thin, flat stick, was used during the Nara period. Kept at the latrine and cleaned afterward, it was inserted between the buttocks and gently scraped. It was functional, reusable, and terrifying to modern sensibilities. The world, you see, was filled with creativity in the face of necessity. No one culture had a monopoly on discomfort, but each found a way to manage the reality of the human body. Whether through water, cloth, wood, or stone, wiping was a daily act that remained hidden in plain sight, mentioned in few texts, passed down by word of mouth, and practiced in silence. And this was only the beginning, because as history crept forward toward plague and papermaking, toward chamber pots and city sewers, our methods grew more complicated, more eccentric, and in some ways, more disturbing. And soon, very soon, things would get worse before they got better. As the Middle Ages unfolded across Europe, the contours of hygiene became increasingly dictated by class, geography, and season. This was not an era of standardized habits. It was a patchwork of customs, shaped by whatever was available, tolerated despite all better judgment. Wiping, ever a private matter, grew more complicated as towns swelled and latrines multiplied, but not necessarily improved. In rural villages, where most of the population lived, outhouses were rare. Instead, people relieved themselves in designated corners of the yard, or in the woods, or even into simple buckets inside the home. These night soil buckets, often shared among family members, were emptied in the morning, sometimes directly into the fields. Afterward, wiping with straw, rags, or leaves remained common. If you were lucky enough to have access to moss, it was soft and absorbent. If not, a piece of old wool or flax cloth already used and washed a dozen times had to do. These cloths were kept in baskets beside the bucket or pit, rinsed in the nearest stream, and hung to dry. There was little discussion of germs. No one imagined invisible microbes leaping from one backside to another. Disease spread quietly, wrapped in the silent knowledge that something wasn't right, but no one knew how to fix it. In medieval towns, matters became worse. With more people and less space, sanitation collapsed under its own weight. Chamber pots were the norm for those in multi-story housing. Often, these were emptied into the streets below. The famous phrase "gardeloo" in Scotland served as a shouted warning derived from the French garde l'eau to avoid the splatter of someone dumping their pot out the window. After using a pot, wiping was often a frantic scramble. Cloth scraps were again the most common, but if those ran out, bits of paper, straw, or hay were used. Newspaper was centuries away, so were the luxuries of mass-produced linen. Instead, people recycled everything. Old clothing, flour sacks, broken pages from damaged prayer books, even old birch bark. In wealthier households, wiping might be accompanied by scented water or an herbal rinse. But the gap between rich and poor was more than monetary, it was biological. The rich could isolate their filth behind closed doors, while the poor lived with it in every breath. Castles, for all their grandeur, hid hygiene behind stone walls. The garderobe, a small protruding room built high over the moat, served as a toilet. Waste dropped directly into the water below, where it either flowed away or festered until the next rain. Wiping materials in these towers were kept nearby. Cloths, dried grass, even feathers. Sometimes, castle latrines had benches with small holes, like a crude form of modern toilet seats. But there was no privacy in the medieval sense. Servants might stand nearby. Air fresheners did not exist, and smells were simply tolerated, accepted as part of the castle's life. In monasteries, where silence was sacred and cleanliness a moral virtue, monks practiced their own hygiene rituals. Communal latrines, called reredouters, sat at the far end of cloisters. Wiping here was sometimes done with moss collected from nearby forests, or with special cloths kept only for the purpose. These cloths were labeled, washed regularly, and rotated by the sacristan. But even monks could not escape the occasional outbreak of dysentery or the rising tide of lice and parasites that plagued medieval communities. The Black Death brought terror and chaos, but it also drew attention to the need for cleaner living. People began to associate filth with illness, not in a scientific sense, but in a superstitious one. Some believed foul odors carried disease miasmas, as they called them, and so they hung bundles of herbs near latrines, carried posies to their faces, or burned incense after relieving themselves. Wiping, though, remained crude. Scented linen was sometimes used by the upper classes, but most continued with rags, straw, or worse. In some villages, it became custom to burn used cloth after wiping. In others, it was simply buried. There were no trash collectors, no plumbing. You took care of your waste as best you could, and often, best wasn't very good. In seafaring communities, wiping took on its own challenges. On medieval ships, crewmen used the open sea for relieving themselves, hanging their backsides over the edge of a board jutting from the ship's side, called the head. With no fresh water to spare, they wiped with whatever they had. Rope fibers, old sail scraps, or simply rinsed with seawater. It was brutal. But the ocean offered a kind of cleansing that land could not. In icy Nordic settlements, snow remained a favorite. Rolled into small balls or scooped with fur, it served as a cold but effective method. The chill numbed any discomfort and it melted cleanly away. Back in Central Europe, the development of public bathhouses briefly improved matters. People bathed together, talked together, and sometimes wiped together. Cloths were shared, rinsed, and reused in community basins. But these bathhouses also became centers of disease and rumor. The church grew suspicious, associating communal bathing with immorality. Slowly, they fell out of favor. Hygiene returned to the shadows. By the 15th century, as printing technology advanced, pages of rough paper became more available. Not valuable books, no one wiped with scripture, but misprints, damaged pages, and discarded pamphlets found second lives in the privy. It wasn't until centuries later that the idea of paper meant for wiping would be realized. But even then, it was met with skepticism. Why spend money on something you're just going to throw away? That mindset would persist well into the 19th century. In the meantime, humanity trudged on, dragging its rags, its moss, its feathers and snowballs, ever in search of something softer, something cleaner, something just a little less medieval. And yet, as we will soon see, even as enlightenment dawned, even as cities modernized and doctors spoke of germs and health, the story of wiping would take darker turns, weirder inventions, and some truly horrific detours. Because before it got better, it got worse. As the dawn of the Renaissance cast longer shadows across Europe, wiping evolved with the times, but not necessarily in ways that brought comfort or decency. This was the age of exploration, invention, and intellectual flourishing. And yet, the most basic human rituals still lagged far behind. In noble households, where scholars pored over astronomy and painters experimented with light, the toilet remained a simple wooden seat over a hole, tucked in cold stone corridors. Servants were still tasked with managing chamber pots, emptying them into cesspits, or carting them outside city walls under the cover of early morning. In these homes, wiping became more ceremonial than sanitary. Linen cloths embroidered with family crests were no longer uncommon, used only once, then burned or ritually cleansed. Perfumed water, soaked sponges, and even velvet trimming made appearances in the wealthiest manners, not because they were effective, but because discomfort was seen as distasteful. And yet, for the vast majority of people, wiping had not changed. The countryside still relied on straw. Bark was still stripped from trees and forests and softened in boiling water to become pliable enough for use. The art of suffering had merely become more refined. In Italy, where public life burst with color and movement, shared latrines became architectural features. They lined the outer walls of buildings, stone slabs with carved openings above shared trenches. These public facilities rarely included wiping materials, so users brought their own. Rolled linen or reused scraps were common, tucked discreetly into pouches or baskets. At night, they were washed by hand in fountains or streams. In England, wiping took on regional quirks. In some towns, it was customary to use wool soaked in vinegar or brine, believed to fight illness and odor. In others, a simple stone would do smooth river stones, set aside and reused, sometimes pass, down through generations. The family cleansing stone, if you will. Meanwhile, across the sea, early settlements were introducing new habits and challenges. European settlers in the Americas faced unfamiliar landscapes. Forests were dense, winters harsh, and some local plants could irritate the skin. Early colonists often used dried corn cobs for personal hygiene. The texture was rough, but served the purpose. Cobs could be cleaned and set aside for reuse. Children were taught early how to hold the cob properly. In cold winters, they were sometimes warmed near a fire first. Indigenous peoples had their own traditions. Soft mosses, river reeds, and snow were common in northern regions. In warmer areas, plantain leaves and clay were used. But as settlers expanded, they often overlooked native methods in favor of their own, less comfortable customs. This reflected cultural misunderstanding. In cities like Paris, where Renaissance ideas influenced many aspects of life, waste systems became more complex, but hygiene remained limited. Underground sewers were constructed but lacked proper ventilation. Streets were paved but still stained. People cleaned with cloths, rinsing them in water that was also used for cooking. In some areas, the same container served multiple purposes. Illnesses spread, though their causes were unknown. In eastern regions, practices differed. In the Ottoman Empire and parts of Persia, water-based cleansing was common. Lavatories often contained vessels for washing rather than merely wiping. Travelers admired the cleanliness of these customs, even if they did not adopt them personally. Europe, however, remained focused on dry methods. In France and Spain, feathers dipped in rosewater became fashionable among the upper classes. Servants cared for these feathers, often without protective gear, leading to common but overlooked illnesses. In small villages, communal outhouses were common, simple wooden structures with narrow benches and buckets. Privacy was limited. Families shared these facilities, neighbors waited outside. Cleaning was done quietly, using whatever materials were available. Children learned early lessons about hygiene and caution. During the Enlightenment, scientific and health ideas advanced, but personal hygiene was a minor concern. Philosophers discussed ethics, astronomy, and government, but rarely cleanliness. The body remained a private matter, even as cities grew and epidemics recurred. In the late 18th century, the bidet was introduced. Originating in France, it was a low basin designed for washing. Initially met with skepticism or humor, it became popular among aristocrats. Often made of porcelain and placed near chamber pots, it was used with scented water, sometimes integrated into elegant furniture. This invention marked a shift toward water-based cleansing rather than scraping. However, the bidet did not become common elsewhere. In Britain and America, it was seen as extravagant or improper. Water was mainly for drinking and hand washing. Thus, traditional methods like cloths, straw, and stone continued. Even as political revolutions changed societies and science advanced, ordinary people still faced the everyday question of how to maintain personal hygiene with limited resources and knowledge. How do I wipe today? And will it be better than yesterday? As we approach the 19th century, the pieces begin to shift. Factories rise. Paper becomes cheaper. The printing press hums with new life. And soon, a strange idea begins to take shape, one that will change everything. Wiping, at long last, is about to enter the age of industry. But before that happens, before we celebrate the advent of soft-rolled comfort, we must face the final horrors. What people tried before toilet paper truly arrived, the mistakes, the miscalculations, the medical consequences. Because, as always in history, things had to get worse before they got better. By the early 1800s, the world was beginning to change in ways no latrine could keep up with. Cities pulsed with the clang of iron and coal. Steamships and railroads compressed geography, and factories began to spew out everything from textiles to tin. But even as industrialization dawned and urban life expanded vertically and horizontally, the daily act of wiping, one of the most basic rituals of human life, still lagged centuries behind. In London, where soot-blackened buildings towered over narrow alleys and filthy gutters, hygiene remained a whispered afterthought. The upper class, eager to appear refined, leaned heavily into perfumed cloths, lace-fringed personal rags, and bowls of water laced with lavender. These implements were kept hidden in ornate cabinets or behind velvet curtains, out of sight, even in private moments. Middle-class families might reuse soft muslin or cut strips from worn-out garments, kept in a box near the chamber pot and rinsed after each use. These cloths were often shared among household members, washed in the same bucket of water used to clean floors or soak laundry. For the working poor, the experience was far rougher. In overcrowded tenements with shared outdoor privies, wiping was a matter of ingenuity and desperation. Old newspaper scraps were coveted, as were packaging papers from grocers and apothecaries. The Times and the Post were read not just for news, but for their absorbency. Some landlords provided baskets of rags that hung from hooks inside the outhouse, rags that were rarely washed and often crawling with bacteria. In rural areas, things weren't much better. Farmers still used straw, hay, or corn cobs. In northern regions, people sometimes used frozen moss in winter, or simply snow, an experience described by travelers as both bracing and humiliating. In mountainous areas of Eastern Europe, flat stones were collected during summer, heated near the fire, and stored near latrine pits to provide a modicum of warmth before wiping. In the Americas, westward expansion was in full swing. Settlers crossing the frontier carried little with them beyond survival essentials, and wiping was relegated to whatever nature provided. Corn cobs continued to dominate in homesteads and wagons. Sometimes they were tied to strings and hung on nails for reuse. Travelers' journals from the Oregon Trail mention personal brushes, bundles of straw or cloth tied together, often used communally. In mining towns, public outhouses were little more than wooden planks above cesspools, and wiping tools included burlap scraps, leather offcuts, and whatever had been discarded by the general store. Diseases like dysentery and cholera ran rampant in such places. Hygiene was always an afterthought, if considered at all. Across the Atlantic in France, a different story was unfolding. The bidet, once seen as a curiosity of the nobility, began appearing in bourgeois homes. It became not just a symbol of cleanliness, but of refinement and civility. Porcelain fixtures, shaped like basins or tiny bathtubs, were installed next to chamber pots. They required no plumbing, just a jug of warm water and time. The French saw wiping as incomplete without rinsing. But again, this was a luxury of class. For the poor, rags or newspaper remained the only choice. In Germany and parts of Scandinavia, a similar dichotomy played out. The wealthy used cloth towels and infused soaps, while the common folk relied on birch bark or worn-out linens, cleaned occasionally in cold streams. In especially remote villages, dried grass tied into bundles was passed from one household to another. Children learned early which weeds caused rashes and which didn't. Meanwhile, in urban centers like Berlin and Stockholm, shared privies became part of the tenement experience. These public facilities were rarely cleaned. Wiping materials were up to the user, and fights over usable paper were not uncommon. In Russia, the long winters posed particular challenges. Snow remained a viable method clean, if frigid. Birch twigs, soft mosses, and even ice chunks were recorded in household journals. In some Orthodox monasteries, monks were known to use smooth river stones, washed each night in silence, part of their ritual penance. In the Middle East, water remained dominant. The tradition of istinja, cleaning oneself with water after defecation, was widespread and embedded in both religious practice and cultural habit. Copper jugs or ceramic ewers were standard in homes and mosques. Wiping alone was considered unclean. In India, similar customs prevailed. The lota, a small round vessel, was used for water cleansing. Hands were washed thoroughly with soap afterward, and most homes kept a dedicated washing area for this purpose. Ironically, these methods, seen by some Europeans as primitive or foreign, were far more hygienic than the cloths and cobs of the West. Japan had its own tradition, dating back centuries. The use of kugi, small wooden spatulas used to scrape rather than wipe. These were often rinsed in streams or wiped clean with cloth. In some households, paper was used sparingly, delicate and handmade. It was too precious to waste in quantity. It's worth noting that this predated industrial toilet paper by several centuries. But in much of the industrialized world, especially English-speaking countries, a great shift was on the horizon. In 1857, an American entrepreneur named Joseph Gaiety introduced medicated paper for personal hygiene. Sold in flat sheets, infused with aloe, and marketed as a cure for hemorrhoids, Gaiety's paper was a commercial flop. People were simply not ready to spend money on something they'd been improvising for free. But Gaiety planted the seed. As the 19th century marched forward, literacy rates rose, newspapers flourished, and paper became cheap. Households grew used to handling paper daily, and some began to wonder if it might have a more intimate use. The idea of wiping with a purpose-made product no longer seemed absurd. By the 1870s, the Scott brothers in Philadelphia began selling toilet paper on rolls. The product was coarse, full of splinters, and often unwrapped, but it was a beginning. The Scott Paper Company took a different approach. They sold to hotels, department stores, and railroad companies, embedding toilet paper into the infrastructure of modern life. Suddenly, people were wiping with something new, something made for the job. It was the birth of a revolution. Yet even then, adoption was slow. Outhouses still reigned in most homes. Rags, newspapers, and cobs were still in use, and many distrusted this strange new paper. Doctors warned of potential injuries. Clergy deemed it decadent. But it was here, and it was spreading. And while the wiping experience was finally changing, the early years of toilet paper were filled with awkward mistakes, misbranded cures, and manufacturing errors that made things, somehow, even worse before they got better. And so we inch closer to modernity, not with comfort but with confusion, because wiping, like all progress, took time, trial, and error. By the final decades of the 19th century, the concept of toilet paper had left its experimental infancy behind and was slowly threading its way into the fabric of daily life, but not without resistance. Most households still treated wiping as a utilitarian, often inconvenient necessity. People remained deeply loyal to whatever materials had served them during their formative years. In rural America, old Sears Roebuck catalogs became a favorite, not because they were particularly soft, but because they were plentiful, hung neatly in outhouses, and after the ink faded, the pages served a second life as wiping sheets. In fact, for some families, a fresh catalog's arrival was less about shopping and more about restocking their improvised lavatory paper. Farmers recalled the sharp edge of glossy advertisements and learned quickly to crumple and soften each sheet before use. In urban households, especially those of the emerging middle class, attitudes began to shift. The convenience and novelty of pre-cut, purpose-made wiping paper gained appeal. But early versions were not comforting. The manufacturing process had not yet figured out how to remove wood pulp splinters, resulting in uncomfortable, sometimes painful experiences. Still, it was a sign of progress. Flush toilets were becoming more common, particularly in wealthier homes. With them came porcelain bowls, water tanks, and pipes, a modern convenience that made using soft, dissolvable material more than just a luxury. It became a necessity. Wiping with corn husks or rags could clog these new systems, and thus, purpose-made toilet paper began its slow conquest. Yet, manufacturers faced challenges. Marketing personal hygiene was still taboo. Ads couldn't say the word toilet, let alone describe what the product was for. Euphemisms like sanitary rolls or soft bathroom tissues appeared instead. Packaging remained discreet, usually wrapped in brown paper or sold behind counters. Customers would ask in hushed tones. Salespeople would retrieve the rolls from under the counter like contraband. In Victorian England, Queen Victoria's court upheld standards of delicacy that forbade open discussions of bodily functions. Yet behind closed doors, aristocratic calm, ideas about cleanliness and personal care passed down through generations shaped daily life. Meanwhile, across the ocean, new settlements introduced fresh habits and challenges. European settlers in the Americas faced unfamiliar environments, dense forests, harsh winters, and local plants that could cause discomfort. Early colonists often used natural materials for personal care, which they cleaned and reused. Children were taught early how to handle these properly, sometimes warming them during cold months. Indigenous peoples had their own long-standing traditions suited to their climates, such as using soft mosses or leaves. As settlers expanded, they often overlooked native methods in favor of their own customs, reflecting cultural misunderstandings. In European cities like Paris, where Renaissance ideals influenced many aspects of life, waste systems became more complex, but hygiene remained limited. Sewers were built but lacked ventilation, and streets were paved but still stained. People used cloths rinsed in water, also used for cooking, sometimes even drinking. Illnesses spread without clear causes. In eastern regions, different practices prevailed. In the Ottoman Empire and parts of Persia, water-based cleansing was common, with vessels for washing and lavatories. Travelers admired these customs for their cleanliness, even if they did not adopt them. Europe remained focused on dry methods. In France and Spain, feathers dipped in scented water were fashionable among upper classes. Servants cared for these feathers, often without protection, leading to frequent illnesses. In small villages, communal facilities were common, simple wooden structures with limited privacy. Families shared these, neighbors waited outside. Children learned early lessons about personal care and caution. During the Enlightenment, scientific and health ideas advanced, but personal hygiene was a minor concern. Philosophers debated ethics, astronomy, and government, rarely cleanliness. The body remained private, even as cities grew and epidemics recurred. In the late 18th century, a new device emerged in France designed for personal washing. Initially met with skepticism, it gained popularity among aristocrats. Often made of porcelain and placed near chamber pots, it was used with scented water and sometimes incorporated into elegant furniture. This invention marked a shift toward washing rather than scraping. However, it did not become common elsewhere. In Britain and America, it was considered extravagant or improper. Water was mainly for drinking and hand washing. Traditional methods continued. Even as political revolutions transformed societies and science advanced, ordinary people faced daily challenges managing personal care with limited resources and knowledge. While the 20th century would bring comfort and convenience, it would also bring strange inventions, cultural clashes, and a series of unfortunate experiments that took wiping to bizarre, sometimes disastrous extremes. The worst, as always, was yet to come. As the 20th century dawned, the world was on the brink of modernization in every conceivable aspect. Technology, medicine, transportation, and hygiene too began to catch up. Toilet paper, once a novelty, was now a manufactured commodity. But while its production scaled up, its adoption still varied dramatically depending on geography, class, and infrastructure. In North America, cities embraced plumbing systems with greater vigor than rural regions. By the 1910s, many middle-class homes in urban areas featured indoor bathrooms. The porcelain throne, gleaming with its coiled pipes and polished handles, now had its loyal companion, a roll of soft, dissolvable tissue, hanging delicately from a brass or wooden holder. The days of corn husks and catalog pages began to wane, though slowly. Even as manufacturers like Scott and Northern perfected the texture and safety of their paper, many families resisted buying something they believed could be improvised. Depression-era frugality reinforced this. During the 1930s, as economic collapse gripped millions, every penny counted. Households once again turned to newspapers, magazines, and even schoolwork for wiping. Ads in Reader's Digest boasted of luxury you can afford, but reality dictated otherwise. Yet behind the curtain of austerity, innovation pressed forward. The double-ply roll was introduced. Perforations improved. Scented variants emerged. But toilet paper remained, in many households, a compromise between comfort and cost. Meanwhile, the world hurtled into war. The First and Second World Wars did not halt bathroom evolution. Rather, they highlighted its necessity. Soldiers stationed in remote trenches or jungles were issued standard-issue toilet paper, usually one-ply, coarse, and limited. In some cases, it was part of a survival kit, wedged between canned rations and iodine tablets. In others, it was a luxury, quickly used up and replaced by moss, leaves, or the ubiquitous military sock. Letters home described the challenges. Cold mornings, biting wind, a tin latrine barely shielding from the elements, and a single square of paper rationed like gold. Some soldiers joked about using orders from headquarters as makeshift wipes. After all, bad orders deserved rough endings. In prisoner of war camps, toilet hygiene was often non-existent. Disease spread rapidly. Infections from poor wiping, contaminated water, and shared rags became a silent killer. Medical officers who understood basic sanitation tried their best to enforce hand washing and proper disposal, but soap was rare and tissue even rarer. After the wars, peace brought a consumer boom. Suburbs sprang up like mushrooms, each with rows of pastel-colored homes, white fences, and shiny bathrooms. Toilet paper advertising entered its golden age. No longer hidden behind counters, rolls were now displayed openly. Brands competed with slogans like "softness you deserve" and "clean comfort every time." Television commercials showed smiling housewives placing tissue rolls beside matching towels. Children giggled as puppies unrolled them down the hallway. It was a new kind of cleanliness, one tied to modernity, pride, and identity. But not everyone joined this clean sweep. In much of Europe, the bidet remained a household staple. France, Italy, Spain all retained their preference for rinsing rather than wiping. Toilet paper was viewed as supplementary, not primary. The cultural divide widened. In Germany, some households used cloth pads, washed and reused in small buckets beside the toilet. In Scandinavia, peat moss and paper pulp formed biodegradable pads that dissolved in septic systems. Innovation danced with tradition. In Asia, particularly in Japan, a revolution was brewing. The 1980s saw the birth of the washlet, a fusion of Western toilets and Eastern hygiene philosophy. With the press of a button, warm water would cleanse the user, followed by gentle air drying. It was luxury, yes, but also science. Sensors detected presence, deodorizing fans activated automatically, and soft music played to mask sounds. Toilet paper became almost optional, And yet, in the West, the obsession with softness grew. By the 1990s, American brands boasted triple-ply comfort, lotion-infused layers, and quilted textures. Rolls were sold in packs of 36, touted as family value. People joked that toilet paper was the only product where the phrase "bigger is better" truly applied. But with abundance came waste. Environmentalists warned that wiping habits were harming forests. Manufacturing virgin pulp for ultra-soft tissue meant cutting down old-growth trees. Recycling was possible, but less profitable. Awareness campaigns emerged. Some consumers shifted to bamboo-based or recycled tissue. Others explored bidet attachments. But most remained loyal to the roll. And then, in the early 21st century, disaster struck not from war or disease, but from panic. In 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic swept the globe, toilet paper vanished from store shelves. Videos surfaced of shoppers fighting in aisles, hoarding carts full of rolls, guarding them like treasure. Memes exploded. Headlines declared it the Great Toilet Paper Shortage. For the first time in a century, the modern world was reminded of its fragility, its dependence on a commodity once made from Sears catalogs and corn cobs. People rediscovered alternatives: cloths, sponges, even leaves. The past whispered through the cracks of civilization, reminding everyone that the comforts of today are only recent, only temporary. In response, some embraced change. Bidet sales soared. Others invested in emergency wipes or DIY toilet paper kits. Suddenly, the old ways didn't seem so distant. And as the panic faded, a new conversation began. What does it mean to be clean? Is wiping enough? Should we be rinsing? Should we be preserving forests or protecting plumbing? Toilet paper, once taboo, now stood at the center of debate. Schools taught children about septic-safe disposal. Offices posted signs in restrooms reminding workers not to flush paper towels. Even airlines rethought their bathroom supplies. In space, astronauts used special wipes designed to work in zero gravity. In Antarctica, scientists developed biodegradable sheets that could survive sub-zero disposal. The future, it seemed, was as strange as the past. And still, the story of wiping wasn't done. From Roman sponges to smart toilets, from rag buckets to sensor-activated washlets, the human quest for cleanliness had evolved dramatically. Yet one truth remained. No matter the age, no matter the culture, no matter the technology, the act of wiping, its discomfort, its privacy, its necessity connected us all. But history had one final twist, one darker corner to explore. Because the strangest, most horrifying methods of all were yet to be revealed. And they were real. As the 21st century unfolded, the technologies we once dreamed about became reality. We built self-driving cars, sent probes beyond Pluto, and held libraries in the palms of our hands. Yet in bathrooms around the world, the most basic ritual, cleaning oneself after defecation, still tethered us to ancient dilemmas. It was a paradox. A society that could clone animals and edit genes still debated over wet wipes versus bidets, over three-ply softness or septic, safe austerity. And so began a quiet but profound transformation, one that revisited old ideas with new tools and questioned what hygiene would mean in the future. In urban America, the bathroom became a design feature. Architects created spa-like retreats with ambient lighting, rainfall showers, and Japanese-style toilets that offered temperature control, front and rear cleansing, and even built-in music. Once symbols of royalty, such luxuries now adorned condominiums and high-end hotels. The toilet paper roll, once humble, was still present but increasingly optional. Bidet attachments surged in popularity. Originally considered exotic or European, they gained traction among millennials seeking cleaner, greener solutions. YouTubers posted reviews of the best models, Reddit threads debated water pressure angles and heated seat preferences. And in this revolution, something surprising happened. People began to talk openly about wiping. Podcasts explored its cultural dimensions. Articles asked why some cultures rinsed while others rubbed. Hygiene became not only a matter of cleanliness, but of identity, history, and morality. Yet beyond the glow of chrome faucets and marble tiles, another world existed. In refugee camps, rural hospitals, overcrowded prisons, and regions devastated by climate change, sanitation remained primitive. According to the UN, over 2 billion people lacked access to safe toilets. In many places, communal pit latrines served dozens of families. There was no toilet paper, no soap, just sticks, stones, sand, or rags passed from hand to hand, barely cleaned, reused endlessly. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, NGO workers distributed sanitation kits containing reusable cloths, vinegar sprays, and instruction manuals on personal hygiene. In slums outside Mumbai, families built makeshift toilets over rivers, the waste flowing directly into water sources. Young children, too small to squat over planks, often defecated in open alleyways. Mothers cleaned them with torn fabric dipped in ash. The risk of infection was constant. In these regions, wiping was not just about comfort, it was about survival. Diarrhea killed more children than war. Parasites burrowed into skin through soiled hands. Schools, without proper sanitation, saw young girls drop out once they reached puberty, unable to manage menstruation with dignity. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, shaped lives and futures. Meanwhile, in wealthier nations, the environmental debate intensified. Each year, Americans used over 36 billion rolls of toilet paper, consuming millions of trees. Activists launched campaigns like Wipe Right and Who Gives a Crap, promoting recycled tissue and subscription-based deliveries. Others championed family cloth reusable flannel wipes, kept in small bins and washed with disinfectant. The idea, once laughable, now found an audience among zero-waste enthusiasts and off-grid households. Critics called it unsanitary. Supporters called it sensible. The clash of values mirrored deeper divides between consumption and conservation, tradition and innovation. And just as the world settled into this new normal, science delivered an unexpected twist. In 2025, researchers at MIT unveiled a prototype of the first self-cleaning skin. Using nanocoatings and microscopic hydrophobic fibers, they demonstrated how human skin could be treated to repel waste entirely. The implications were staggering. If perfected, wiping might become obsolete. Showers would be shorter. Water use would drop. Even clothing could be designed to shed filth. But with excitement came anxiety. Was this safe? Would we lose a piece of our humanity if we no longer had to touch, to clean, to care? Philosophers argued that wiping was a ritual that connected us to our bodies, our mortality. To remove it entirely was to sever ourselves from something essential. And so, the world stood on a threshold. Between stone and sponge, between cloth and code, between necessity and luxury. In that liminal space, strange stories resurfaced. In a small museum in Norway, an exhibit displayed Viking hygiene tools, long-handled scoops carved from antlers, used to clean under layers of woolen garments. In a crypt beneath a Welsh cathedral, archaeologists found remnants of medieval pilgrim tokens, flattened lead badges, likely repurposed as emergency wipes on long treks. In a desert monastery in Egypt, 3rd-century monks inscribed prayers onto strips of papyrus. Some bore signs of having been used not just for reading, but for wiping divine words, quite literally turned to dust. And in a time capsule buried in 1999, schoolchildren left letters, toys, and a single roll of toilet paper, soft, pastel pink, lightly scented. It was meant to show the future what comfort looked like at the dawn of the millennium. But comfort, like wiping, was always relative. And as the capsule was opened in 2099, the archaeologists of the future asked the same question that echoed through centuries. Why did they do it this way? What did it mean? How did it feel? The answers, buried in layers of paper, cloth, moss, and myth, remained as ever deeply human. Because no matter how far we travel through time, how advanced we become, or how sterile our lives grow, the most personal rituals remain rooted in the same needs, the same fears, the same flesh. And in the next chapter, we explore the darkest, most unsettling answers history ever offered to the question, how did people actually wipe before toilet paper? In the dim corridors of forgotten history, as the modern world moved toward technological luxury and bioengineered cleanliness, there still lingered the darkest practices of wiping humanity ever devised rituals, born not of comfort but of desperation, belief, or punishment. And now we go back not to the Romans with their sponges or the Chinese with their paper, but further to a time when the line between hygiene and horror blurred so completely that one could hardly tell if a person was cleaning themselves or offering a sacrifice to survive. In ancient Mesopotamia, buried within cuneiform table, TS not often translated, we find references to rituals involving clay shards. These weren't merely tools for scraping, they were offerings. The belief was that demons of disease clung to the body after defecation, and only by scraping them away with a shard blessed by a temple priest could one be purified. The ritual required the person to speak aloud a prayer to the god Nergal deity of death and plague while wiping, in hopes that the act would appease the spirits lurking in filth. If a child grew ill after using the wrong shard, it was said that a curse had returned through the waste. Across the sea in Iron Age Britain, before the arrival of the Romans, some Celtic tribes were known to use not moss, but rough animal pelts for cleansing strips of fox or boar hide, dried and stiffened by salt and hung from the walls of primitive communal huts. The hides weren't replaced regularly. Instead, they were shared among family members, dipped occasionally in cold river water, and scraped with bone to clean off debris. These wipes became objects of family legacy, passed from mother to daughter like some filthy heirloom. The worst part? Sometimes they were never cleaned at all, merely left to dry in the smoke of the hearth, then reused. In the sun-baked kingdoms of pre-Islamic Arabia, some desert dwellers relied not only on stones, but on burning sand. A common practice among nomads was to scoop dry sand into a shallow pit, let it bake under the sun, and then squat over it. The heat killed bacteria, or so they believed, and the grains of sand clung to residue, pulling it away as one shifted. Children were taught to perform this act at dawn, before the sand became too hot to touch. But older men, hardened by years in the desert, boasted of their ability to use the midday pit. It wasn't about cleanliness, it was about endurance. Elsewhere, the practice grew darker. In certain fringe sects of medieval Europe, particularly during outbreaks of disease, self-flagellation was paired with hygiene. Monks who believed the body to be a vessel of sin would whip themselves after defecating, believing that physical pain could purify what wiping could not. Some took it further, eschewing wiping altogether as a test of faith. They believed that enduring the stench of one's own filth was a holy trial, that demons would flee from the foulness, unable to bear it. There are records of such monks being expelled from monasteries, not for heresy, but for unbearable odor and the spread of lice. And still the question remains, why did they do this? The answer lies not just in custom, but in how humanity understood its own body. In early Eastern Europe, folk belief held that waste carried part of the soul. To remove it too quickly was to lose one's essence. Women in rural villages were warned not to wipe too thoroughly during menstruation, for fear that their future children would be born weak or soulless. In this worldview, wiping wasn't just a sanitary act, it was a mystical danger. The cloths used were often buried afterward, with small stones placed over them to pin the spirit down. The cloth itself might be embroidered with protective symbols before use, stitched by grandmothers who whispered blessings over each thread. In the damp, decaying cities of late medieval Italy, during the height of plague, an even more ghastly practice emerged. Some believed that rubbing waste on the body could prevent infection by distracting or overwhelming the senses of evil spirits seeking to enter. Accounts from Bologna and Florence describe beggars who smeared their bodies in human waste, then used rags dipped in wine to wipe off the thickest filth. These rags were often stolen from laundry lines or pulled from the pockets of the dead. The smell, they said, kept the demons at bay. Modern scholars still debate whether this was a misunderstanding of miasma theory, or simply the final madness of cities collapsing under death. In Siberian shamanistic traditions, excrement was considered a portal. After defecation, the waste was sometimes collected and placed near sacred trees, believed to be the dwelling place of ancestral spirits. The act of wiping was accompanied by chants, and the used materials, mostly birch bark or bundled straw, were burned in small fires lit beneath carved wooden idols. It was not about sanitation, it was a message, a signal to the spirit world that the human body had shed something impure, and with that shedding came transformation. But no era matched the sheer grim inventiveness of the European Middle Ages when it came to punishment through wiping. In certain feudal courts, criminals were sentenced to the Wheel of Filth, a wooden structure placed over a cesspit, with a condemned strapped to it and rotated slowly while guards wiped their body with the waste of others. The ritual was public, meant to shame and degrade. The logic was that if one had defiled society, then society would defile them in return. Survivors of such punishments rare. The infections that followed were often serious, and sometimes fatal. As we review these less discussed pages of history, it becomes clear. Personal cleansing for most of human existence was not primarily about comfort or hygiene. It involved ritual, tradition, discipline, and identity. It reflected cultural fears, beliefs, and taboos. Moving forward, we will see how these legacies combined during industrialization and the rise of new sanitation products events that transform private life profoundly. After centuries of varied cleansing customs from ritualistic to medicinal, the world approached modernity cautiously. Changes in hygiene came gradually during the 18th and 19th centuries, often starting among elites. In pre-Victorian England, where chamber pots were common and waste disposal rudimentary, the earliest forms of specialized cleansing paper emerged as a luxury item. Wealthy individuals used fine fabrics or delicate printed materials for personal care, marking status through their choice of materials. For most people, newspapers or simple cloth remained the norm material, serving multiple everyday purposes. Some in 19th century cities read news in the morning and used the same paper for personal needs. In 1857, Joseph Gaiety introduced medicated sheets marketed for health benefits. Though innovative, adoption was slow as many were unaccustomed to purchasing such products. Later, the Scott Paper Company pioneered perforated tissue rolls, marketed as symbols of cleanliness and modern living, appealing to growing urban markets. By the early 20th century, these products entered homes and institutions, though traditional practices persisted, especially in rural areas with limited plumbing. In places like Japan, ancient practices blended with modern technology, resulting in advanced cleansing devices emphasizing water use and comfort long before similar trends emerged elsewhere. Elsewhere, water-based cleansing remained prevalent, often intertwined with cultural and spiritual practices emphasizing purity. To this day, in many Indian homes, the concept of dry paper is viewed not as advanced, but as insufficient, even unhygienic. In the Middle East, similar traditions prevailed. A combination of water, hand, and soap ruled over modern paper for generations. The bidet sprayer, a small hose attached to the toilet, became a ubiquitous feature. The Western world, with all its fancy packaging and pastel-colored rolls, seemed behind in the eyes of many. And yet, paper triumphed. The post-war consumer boom of the mid-20th century turned toilet paper into an industry of absurdity. Advertisements featured puppies, clouds, and promises of pillowy softness. Colors were introduced to match bathroom decor: pastel blues, pinks, greens, quilted, perfumed, embossed, even scented with lavender or pine. The act of wiping became a marketplace. Companies competed over how little lint their rolls left behind. Stores measured success in shelf space dedicated to softness. But the darker truth? Millions around the world still had no access to any wiping method at all. In many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and rural South America, the struggle for sanitation remained medieval. In places without plumbing, without clean water, wiping became a survival strategy. Leaves, corn cobs, mud, hands. The global sanitation crisis was not solved by paper. It was hidden beneath its softness. Then, the modern world stumbled into an unexpected reckoning. In March 2020, during the early waves of the COVID-19 pandemic, toilet paper disappeared from shelves worldwide. Supermarkets emptied. Fights broke out in aisles. Videos of shoppers hoarding rolls by the dozens went viral. The act of wiping, so private, so rarely discussed, was thrust into public panic. Suddenly, people remembered what they never wanted to think about. What would they do if the paper ran out? Bidet sales surged. Old practices resurfaced. In online forums, people swapped advice on how to make reusable wipes, how to use water instead of tissue, how to return to what their ancestors had done for centuries. The illusion of modernity, of endless paper, had torn like a wet sheet, and beneath it lay history, layered, wrinkled, stained. As we end this long and winding tale, what remains is not just a list of methods or materials. It is a mirror, showing us what we fear, what we value, what we hide. To wipe is to confront the body, to choose softness or scratch, to follow ritual or logic, to trust the hand or the machine. It is the last intimate act of every day, the first lesson of childhood, the final motion of the sick and dying. It is everything we don't say out loud. But now, as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you understand a little more about people, about history, and about the strange, uncomfortable, utterly human story of how we wipe. As the 20th century matured into the strange humming rhythm of post-war modernity, the once unmentionable topic of wiping evolved from a whispered necessity into an economic empire. The toilet paper industry had by now reached full saturation in the Western world. What had begun as folded aloe-infused health sheets in the 1850s was now a race between brands to out-soften, out-scent, and out-luxury one another. Quilted layers, cartoon mascots, and televised commercials turned wiping into something oddly aspirational. No longer just an afterthought, toilet paper became a symbol of domestic success. A well-stocked bathroom lined with triple-ply rolls in pastel hues meant more than hygiene. It meant civilization, comfort, prosperity. In the United States, tissue manufacturers pushed innovation beyond reason. Companies began patenting embossed textures designed to mimic cloth, to promise a cleaner clean, a gentler touch. Sheets were perfumed with rose and chamomile, dyed to match tiled bathrooms, and marketed with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for perfume or fine linens. Advertisements showed smiling mothers placing rolls into pristine white cabinets, a strange image of intimacy and decorum. But beneath the pastel packaging was an economic engine churning at massive scale. By the 1970s, Americans alone were consuming over 2 billion rolls per year. That number would only climb. Factories devoted entire wings to tissue production. Marketing budgets soared. There were loyalty clubs, collectible coupons, even toilet paper brand mascots appearing in parades. Yet, for all its glamour, this industry rested on a fragile truth. Toilet paper was not recyclable in the traditional sense. Used, it became waste. Flushed, it burdened sewage systems. Disposed improperly, it clogged pipes and contaminated waterways. With each flush, modern society ignored the cascading environmental toll of its softness. Elsewhere in the world, the story took different turns. In France and Italy, the bidet remained king. Though often misunderstood or mocked in Anglo cultures, the bidet was a fixture of post-war European bathrooms. Some were ornate porcelain basins standing beside the toilet. Others were built-in attachments with pressure dials and heated water. The concept was simple. Why wipe when you could wash? To Europeans, this was logic. To many Americans, it was still taboo. Meanwhile, in Japan, hygiene technology transcended even that. By the 1980s, Japanese manufacturers introduced electric toilets with integrated bidets. They featured buttons for water temperature, nozzle position, and even white noise to mask the sound of bodily functions. Some had sensors that automatically raised or lowered the seat. Others had built-in air dryers. The most advanced models greeted users with soft lighting and ambient music. It wasn't just clean, it was an experience, a ritual. In Japanese culture, the act of cleansing was inseparable from daily mindfulness. Even public restrooms reflected this respect. Spotless stalls, self-cleaning nozzles, and control panels that looked like spaceship consoles offered a vision of hygiene that was clinical yet calming. At the same time, developing nations told a different story. In parts of Latin America, Africa, and South Asia, access to any sanitary wiping method remained scarce. Open defecation, shared latrines, and lack of clean water meant that millions still relied on improvised methods. Leaves, stones, mud, cloth scraps, all were used where paper or plumbing were absent. In refugee camps and urban slums, humanitarian organizations distributed small bundles of tissue or soap with instructions, often met with confusion. Generations raised on water-based methods saw paper as dirty, not clean. In rural India, wiping continued with water and the left hand, followed by scrubbing with ash or soap. This wasn't primitivism, it was cultural continuity. It was what had worked for centuries in hot, arid regions where water was precious and ritual purity mattered. And yet, Western NGOs arrived with boxes of toilet paper, assuming a one-size-fits-all solution to a problem older than civilization itself. In truth, there was no universal best way, only the methods that fit the land, the belief, the plumbing. But the modern world rarely tolerates diversity in the private sphere. Globalization began to press one ideal upon many. White rolls, triple ply, soft and dry. Hotels across Asia replaced water nozzles with tissue dispensers to cater to Western tourists. Grocery stores expanded their hygiene aisles to include brightly packaged rolls, even in countries that never traditionally used them. Toilet paper became not just a tool, but a signal of wealth, of modernity, of Western alignment. And yet, behind closed doors, many quietly clung to their ways. A spray bottle hidden under the sink, a folded towel beside the toilet, a bucket of water with a dipping cup. The practices endured out of habit, belief, or sheer logic. No matter how many commercials aired, how many puppies played with unraveling rolls, wiping remained an act shaped by memory and meaning. It was no longer just a question of what we used, but who we were. In the next chapter, we will step into the 21st century, where the conversation turns darker. Environmental panic, sewage failures, cultural backlashes, and, yes, new inventions that promise to change everything once again. Because even now, even after thousands of years, humanity still hasn't answered the question, what's the right way to wipe? At the dawn of the 21st century, the quiet, unglamorous ritual of wiping collided with the urgent noise of environmental collapse. As climate reports darkened and landfills overflowed, the global gaze turned toward the toilet not just as a symbol of sanitation, but as a site of consumption. In affluent nations, the numbers were staggering. The average American used nearly 57 sheets of toilet paper per day. That amounted to over 20 sheets per year per person. Multiply that by a nation, and then again by the world, and the picture became less about hygiene and more about deforestation. Entire forests were being pulped to softness. Canada's boreal trees, centuries old, were flattened and fed into industrial mills to satisfy Western preferences for ultra-soft, bleached white tissue. Virgin pulp was favored for its strength and smoothness, despite the availability of recycled alternatives. The logic was circular and absurd. Trees were cut, milled, processed, and flushed. Every roll carried the shadow of a felled forest. Environmentalists raised alarms. Campaigns like the issue with tissue challenged consumers to rethink their daily habits. Could bamboo paper be an answer? Could recycled rolls be normalized? Could Americans, so conditioned to equate comfort with clouds, embrace something rougher, greener, more sustainable? The reaction was slow. Change, it seemed, did not come easily to the most private corners of modern life. Meanwhile, the world of startups and sanitation technology stirred with quiet revolution. In Silicon Valley, a wave of companies emerged with a mission to reimagine how we wiped. Bidet attachments surged in popularity, no longer reserved for boutique European hotels. They were rebranded for the tech-savvy and the eco-conscious. "Ditch the wipe," one slogan read. "Embrace the spray." These devices clipped onto existing toilets, offering adjustable streams of water, heated seats, and sleek, smartphone-compatible controls. Influencers began giving beaded reviews. YouTube was filled with comparisons between paper, spray, and even air-drying models. What had once been taboo was now oddly content. And during the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020, the conversation reached a breaking point. As global panic set in and grocery store shelves emptied, one item vanished almost instantly: toilet paper. Photos went viral, aisles stripped bare, carts piled high, strangers brawling over 12 packs. In Australia, a knife fight erupted over rolls. In the United States, families hoarded entire garages full. It was absurd, comedic, and yet painfully revealing. A century of dependence had left society vulnerable to a shortage of fluff. And in the vacuum, something shifted. People began asking questions. Why are we so reliant on paper? How did we survive before it? Do we need it at all? Sales of bidets and reusable cloth wipes spiked. Homemade solutions emerged. Old habits, like washing with water or using family cloths once considered medieval or unthinkable, were reconsidered. Not out of choice, but out of necessity. For a brief, strange season, modern society stared into the past and saw not disgust, but resilience. The pandemic didn't just disrupt supply chains, it cracked the illusion of permanence. Suddenly, the whole notion of modern hygiene felt flimsy, dependent, fragile, a soft luxury masquerading as a necessity. And with this awakening came discomfort. Governments issued guidelines on wiping alternatives. Environmental groups published digital pamphlets on composting human waste. In rural areas, compost toilets gained traction-dry systems that separated waste into bins, turning it into usable soil over time. Urban dwellers, too, experimented with zero-waste bathrooms. Cloth wipes were washed like baby diapers. Spray bottles, dubbed portable bidets, became popular among travelers and minimalists. In Japan, innovation continued. Some toilets now analyzed waste for health diagnostics, sending reports to smartphones. They glowed with LEDs, played music, eliminated odors with ozone. The toilet, once crude and hidden, became intelligent, integrated, even beautiful. But for most of the world, the revolution was quieter. A shift in thought. A conversation long delayed. People began really talking about what they did behind the door. The silence cracked. Podcasts, documentaries, even TED Talks addressed the question: how do we clean ourselves, and at what cost? And beneath the conversation, something deeper stirred. A recognition that wiping was never just mechanical. It was cultural, psychological, ecological. It touched every part of who we were. In the next part of our story, we will look at resistance, at backlash, at those who refused to let go of paper, who mocked the bidet, who saw alternative hygiene not as progress but as regression. We will step into the modern debates about identity, about dignity, about what we flush and what we hide. As the 21st century continued its uneven march towards sustainability, the conversation around wiping, once confined to the margins of environmental discourse, entered the cultural mainstream awkwardly, haltingly, but with growing urgency. It wasn't just about sanitation anymore. It was about values, about the battle between convenience and conscience, modernity and memory, habit and hope. In households around the world, these conversations quietly simmered. At dinner tables and on long car rides, people admitted, sometimes sheepishly, that they had switched to cloth, that they had installed a bidet, that they missed the softness of paper but not the guilt. In certain communities, particularly among young, environmentally minded families, cloth wipes, once mockingly called family cloths, were celebrated as badges of progress. Washed with the regular laundry, stored in gentle bins beside the toilet, they marked not a regression, but a reimagining. They became symbols of intentional living, of thoughtful consumption. But not everyone embraced the change. Across online forums and editorial pages, resistance bloomed. Critics painted reusable hygiene as unhygienic, regressive, even dangerous. Memes circulated mocking the bidet crowd as elitist or overly precious. News anchors chuckled through segments on toilet paper alternatives, treating the subject with detached amusement. And yet, beneath the laughter, discomfort lingered, a collective unease that something about how we wiped was deeply, irrevocably flawed. In the United States, where toilet paper was practically a cultural institution, brands doubled down on luxury. Quilted, triple-ply, aloe-infused rolls lined the shelves, promising comfort and purity. Marketing campaigns emphasized indulgence, not necessity. Wiping, these ads suggested, was not a function, it was an experience. A moment of self-care, a ritual deserving of the finest pulp. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, innovation took a different path. In India, engineers developed affordable, water-saving bidet solutions for urban slums. In Kenya, social enterprises introduced low-cost sanitation stations that combined washing and drying in portable kits. In Sweden and the Netherlands, public toilets increasingly offered both paper and spray options, allowing users to choose. Hygiene was no longer one-size-fits-all. It was a spectrum of tools, of techniques, of traditions. But with these options came inequality. In refugee camps and rural villages, the question wasn't paper or bidet, but anything or nothing. Millions still lived without reliable sanitation. For them, wiping remained a matter of cloth scraps, discarded newspaper, ash, or nothing at all. The global sanitation crisis loomed in the background, a silent emergency affecting health, education, and dignity. The UN's Sustainable Development Goal 6, clean water and sanitation for all, remained elusive. In this light, the Western debate over toilet paper seemed almost absurd, a luxury problem in a world of urgent need. And yet, it mattered. Because how we wiped reflected how we thought about ourselves, about others, about the planet. It was a mirror, a ritual shaped by culture, warped by capitalism, and now, possibly, redefined by awareness. The future of wiping, it seemed, would not be dictated by softness or scent, but by questions. Could we sustain forests for fluff? Could we design dignity into every stall? Could we unlearn the shame that clung to our most basic functions? Around the world, artists, educators, and activists took up the challenge. Toilet-themed museums opened in Japan and South Korea, tracing the evolution of waste and wiping with surprising reverence. Podcasts explored the anthropology of hygiene. Children's books gently introduced the idea that wiping looked different in different homes, and that difference wasn't disgusting, it was human. Even in schools, new curricula emerged, teaching sanitation not as an afterthought, but as a cornerstone of civilization. And with education came empathy. Slowly, a shift occurred. Toilet paper, once the undisputed king of cleanliness, became one option among many. People began to ask not only, how do I wipe, but why do I wipe this way? The illusion of universality cracked. Behind the closed door, a quiet revolution took hold. And as we look toward the next chapter, we will explore the cutting edge of innovation, of philosophy, of hygiene itself. From AI-enhanced smart toilets to microbial-resistant fabrics, from zero-waste bathroom systems to communal models that redefine privacy, the question isn't just how we wipe, it's how we live. And whether, in the end, we can cleanse not only our bodies, but our assumptions. The story of wiping, stretching from ancient clay shards to quilted rolls and bathroom cabinets, is not just a chronicle of cleanliness. It is a reflection of how humanity has negotiated its place between nature and culture, between the needs of the body and the demands of civilization. And now, as we turn toward the future, we begin to see how innovation, discomfort, and the pursuit of dignity converge in the most private of places. At the edge of this story stand the pioneers of sanitation, engineering individuals and institutions who believe that wiping is not just a habit, but a system to be reimagined. In Japan, for example, the humble bidet has evolved into an object of technological wonder. Known locally as the washlet, this device combines warm water jets, air dryers, seat warmers, and even music to mask sound. Toilets in Tokyo airports greet travelers in multiple languages. Some offer pressure and angle customization, deodorizing filters, and lids that open automatically when you approach. The result is not just efficiency, it's serenity, a merging of ritual and reason. But these luxuries raise a question. Who gets access? Who decides what hygienic dignity should look like? As we peer into the homes of the ultra-rich, we find that bathrooms are becoming shrines. Golden fixtures, voice-activated flushing, toilets that analyze waste for health markers all are part of a larger trend where bodily function meets biosurveillance. In Silicon Valley, some smart toilets promise to track everything from hydration to hormonal shifts. One startup has designed an AI system that maps your microbiome through daily analysis of excrement. Wiping, in such a world, becomes data. Your habits become diagnostics. Your bathroom becomes a clinic. And yet, outside this bubble of advancement, billions still squat over pit latrines. In sub-Saharan Africa, in parts of South Asia, sanitation means plastic bags or communal fields. Children grow up learning to hold it in until they're far from home. Women walk miles at night for privacy. And for many, wiping is a matter of leaves, stones, or bare hands washed in shallow water. The contrast is not just technological, it's moral. It forces us to ask, what is acceptable? What is progress? And can the future of wiping include everyone? Across the world, low-tech innovation tries to answer. In Kenya, the Fresh Life toilet, compact, sealable, and odor-free, is used in slums where plumbing is impossible. In Bangladesh, women's cooperatives craft washable menstrual and hygiene cloths from donated fabric, distributing them door to door. In Brazil, a mobile sanitation project places solar-powered bidet stations on the edges of favelas. These are not gadgets of luxury, they are tools of survival, and they carry a different vision of the future. One where sanitation is not purchased, but provided. Not branded, but shared. In academia, the conversation turns to behavior. Studies explore the psychology of wiping, how children learn it, how adults cling to habit, how shame shapes silence. One paper suggests that toilet paper's dominance in the West has less to do with comfort than with the illusion of control. That wiping with paper, even if incomplete, feels cleaner because it leaves no trace on the hand. That it satisfies not the body but the ego. Meanwhile, environmental economists quantify the cost. Each roll of toilet paper requires 37 gallons of water to produce. The average American uses over 140 rolls per year. That's not hygiene, it's extraction. Forests in Canada and Scandinavia are clear-cut to produce virgin pulp, preferred for its softness. Rivers run dark with dye and bleach, and all of it, once used, is flushed away out of sight, out of mind, but never truly gone. And so a reckoning begins. The next generation of designers, activists, and thinkers asks, what would wiping look like if it were built from scratch? Not from trees, but from values. Could we normalize handheld bidet bottles as they do in Muslim countries? Could we design reusable wipes that are as elegant as linens? Could we build a toilet that composts waste into soil safely, eliminating the need to wipe it all? Could wiping be beautiful? Silent? Zero waste? In some eco-villages, experiments are already underway. Bathrooms without plumbing. Cubicles made of clay and bamboo. Wiping materials crafted from hemp, flax, or wool. Visitors are taught not to be ashamed, but to participate, to see their waste as part of a cycle, not an error. And here, perhaps, lies the deepest truth. That wiping is not just about endings, it's about beginnings. About what we leave behind, and what we're willing to learn again. The past was dirty, the present is conflicted. But the future, however uncertain, might just be cleaner, not because of paper, but because of perspective. As the conversation around hygiene shifts from silence to design, the intersection of technology, sustainability, and equity becomes sharper. No longer is the question simply, what do you wipe with? But what does your wiping say about your place in the world? In the shadow of modern bathrooms, with their polished fixtures and touchless sensors, lies an uncomfortable truth that dignity has always been unevenly distributed. And so we return, once again, to the overlooked inventors and silent revolutions. In rural India, engineers working with local communities have developed the twin-pit latrine system, a simple, inexpensive design that turns human waste into safe compost within months. These toilets are lined with locally sourced bricks, cost less than a smartphone, and eliminate the need for external sewage systems. But their greatest achievement lies in how they redefine wiping not as waste management, but as agricultural renewal. In Ethiopia, bamboo leaf wipes are harvested, boiled, and reused. In Indonesia, coconut husks are softened and dried in the sun, then passed down in family traditions. In rural Mexico, dried corn cobs long used for wiping are being revisited, not with shame, but with pride, as symbols of resilience and adaptation. These practices are not primitive, they are specific. Hay are tailored to landscape, culture, and climate, and in that specificity lies innovation. Meanwhile, Western companies are awakening to the dissonance between convenience and consequence. A new wave of startups market reusable cloth wipes charmingly called family cloths, made from organic cotton, bamboo, or even recycled fabric. They are laundered after use, stored in separate bins, and embraced by those who seek zero waste. Critics call them unhygienic. Advocates call them honest. And somewhere in between lies a redefinition of cleanliness. Not as sterilization, but as stewardship. The language around wiping also begins to shift. No longer confined to euphemisms, bathroom tissue. Personal cleansing conversations become direct, educational, and empathetic. Podcasts explore the environmental impact of wipes. Children's books teach composting toilets. Medical professionals discuss wiping techniques not just as sanitation, but as self-care. For people with disabilities, this reframing is essential. The act of wiping, often invisible, is a daily challenge that many cannot perform unaided. Yet for decades, public discourse ignored this reality. Now, accessible hygiene devices ranging from long-handled wands to bidet attachments with voice control are becoming more available, more affordable, and more openly discussed. For the first time, wiping is being treated not as a private shame, but as a shared experience, one with design implications, policy consequences, and emotional weight. In this evolution, art and literature play their part. Exhibits like The Toilet Papers at modern museums invite guests to reconsider the history of hygiene. Contemporary poets write odes to the bidet. Short films explore the rituals of the bathroom with tenderness and curiosity. On social media, influencers discuss wiping preferences not with vulgarity, but with sincerity, sharing their switch to bamboo paper, their experience with cloth wipes, their awkward bidet moments. The taboo is eroding. Not because people are crude, but because they're curious. They want to understand how something so daily, so defining, has been hidden in plain sight. Across cities, municipalities experiment with new standards. Some public restrooms offer bidet-equipped stalls. Others provide paper made from recycled office documents. Composting toilets appear at festivals, parks, and tiny home communities. These are not gimmicks. They are prototypes of a world where wiping is clean not just for the person, but for the planet. In this world, the future toilet is not porcelain. It is adaptable. It learns your preferences. It composts your waste. It generates energy. It tells you when you're sick. It does not flush waste into oceans, it returns nutrients to the soil. And in such a world, perhaps the act of wiping itself changes. Perhaps it disappears altogether, replaced by washing, drying, sensing. Perhaps it becomes something so seamless, so integrated into the human rhythm, that it no longer needs to be taught. Perhaps we finally stop asking children, awkwardly, "Did you wipe?" and instead teach them, confidently, "This is how we care for our bodies, our homes, and our earth." Because at the heart of it all, beneath the clay shards of ancient Mesopotamia, the silk cloths of Tang China, the sponge sticks of Rome, and the golden nozzles of Tokyo, wiping has always been more than cleaning. It is a mirror of what we value, of what we ignore, of who we become when no one else is watching. In the end, as we look back across the span of human history, not just through the lens of empires and inventions, but through the quiet, intimate rituals of daily survival, few acts feel as deeply human as wiping. It is simple, it is necessary, and yet it is the product of geography, economy, ingenuity, and taboo. From the riverbank to the smart toilet, every culture has solved the same problem differently, reflecting its fears, its values, and its vision of the body. But the journey does not end here, with porcelain and perfumed wipes. It continues forward, into an era of planetary awareness. Because as we flush, we contribute to systems we rarely see: pipes that crack beneath cities, treatment plants that strain with overuse, oceans that carry the scent of our convenience. And so the act of wiping must evolve again, not with novelty, but with wisdom. Composting toilets return us to the cycle of nature. Bidets reduce our need for paper. Innovations in sanitation science offer dry-clean methods that use electrostatics and airflow. And across the globe, communities reclaim forgotten traditions, washing with water, using natural materials, embracing cultural humility. But there is also another evolution, quieter, deeper, the evolution of language. We begin to speak about wiping not with embarrassment, but with empathy. Parents teach children about hygiene as care, not correction. Schools integrate sanitation into science, not silence. Governments treat hygiene not as infrastructure alone, but as human dignity. And in this new framework, wiping becomes part of a larger conversation about touch, about time, about the right to feel clean and cared for, no matter who you are. It becomes part of gender equity, disability rights, environmental justice. Because to ask, "How do you wipe?" is also to ask, "Are you seen? Are you safe? Are you included in the design of the world?" These are not trivial questions. They are the ones that shape our cities, our tools, our sense of what it means to be modern. We have traveled far from the cold latrines of feudal castles and the sponge sticks of Roman latrines. We have built towers that touch clouds and toilets that sing songs. We have wrapped our most private acts in silence, then slowly unwrap them again, layer by layer, culture by culture, until what remains is not shame, but curiosity, and that curiosity is a gift. It is the reason we can talk about wiping now, not with awkwardness, but with awe. Because in this small act, this invisible motion repeated billions of times each day, we find traces of everything we are: clever, cautious, creative, caring. The story of how people wiped before toilet paper is not gross. It is grand. It is a record of who had resources and who improvised, of how trees became pulp, and pulp became politics, of how silk and corn and moss and snow and stone and bamboo and rags were folded into the story of being human. And yes, it gets worse when we ignore the cost, when we silence those with no access, when we pollute with no plan. But it also gets better when we learn, when we listen, when we choose designs that honor the planet and the people who live on it. So as you fall asleep tonight, perhaps with soft sheets and a quiet hum of plumbing in the walls, take a moment to remember that you are part of this history too. Not just in your preferences, but in your questions, in your willingness to learn how others wipe, and why it matters. Because beneath the humor and the history, there is a quiet truth: what we do when no one is watching defines us more than we know. Sleep well. To understand the full weight of how people have dealt with cleanliness throughout the ages, we must not only look at the tangible materials cobs, stones, cloth, and paper, but also at the systems built around them, the infrastructures, the philosophies, the quiet, invisible contracts of what was acceptable, what was luxurious, and what was simply endured. In the early modern period, spanning roughly from the late 15th century to the 18th century, Europe was a continent of extremes. At one end were palaces gilded with mirrors and perfumes. At the other, alleys filled with waste, rotting straw, and communal privies that had not been emptied in weeks. And in both places, the need to wipe remained universal. But how that need was answered was anything but equal. In Renaissance Italy, for instance, elite families like the Medici embraced imported innovations not only in the arts but in their bathrooms. Fragrant cloths infused with herbs such as lavender and rosemary were used for intimate cleaning, believed not just to cleanse but to fortify the spirit and ward off disease. Paper, still costly and made from cotton rags, was sometimes used once and burned, especially in noble homes. But for most commoners across Italy and France, wiping meant what was available: strips of worn linen, dried moss, old bread crusts, or the leaves of the mulberry tree, depending on season and climate. In the cold north, winter months brought new challenges. Snow itself, while brutally cold, often became a makeshift cleaning tool. People squatted over drifted snowbanks or gathered packed snowballs, sometimes even brought them indoors when outhouses froze. The sting was sharp, but the clean sensation was undeniable, and in the absence of better options, many came to prefer it. Meanwhile, in England, the development of early print culture led to unexpected consequences. Discarded pages from pamphlets, failed manuscripts, or old Bibles, yes. Even sacred texts were sometimes repurposed in privy corners. The outhouse, usually a dark wooden shed with a deep pit and a rickety bench, would have nails or pegs driven into its walls, where torn paper or fabric scraps were hung. If a household could not afford waste paper, they often used straw or hay, despite its tendency to irritate skin. And though they rarely spoke of it, people knew which plants in their garden gave the cleanest wipe: the broad-leafed dock, the soothing comfrey, the thick burdock. These became quiet allies in a world where plumbing was still a fantasy. But in the cities, the real crisis was not what people wiped with, it was where it all went. Chamber pots were emptied out of windows. Street-level gutters, called kennels, ran with filth. In London, the smell of summer was the smell of rot, and night soil men workers who came after dusk to remove waste became crucial, though often reviled, figures. They hauled cart. As cities grew, waste management was a serious challenge. People disposed of refuse into streets, rivers, or fields, leading to outbreaks of diseases like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. Public health advocates pushed for better sanitation systems. In various countries, engineers and reformers developed improved sewer networks and waste treatment methods. These efforts slowly brought hygiene into public discussion, not just as comfort, but as vital for survival. In some cultures, personal cleansing practices differed markedly. Water-based cleansing was common and culturally significant in many regions, involving specific traditional tools and rituals. Travelers noted these customs with interest, even if they did not adopt them. Other societies preferred dry methods, each reflecting deep-rooted beliefs and worldviews. New sanitation devices emerged in certain parts of the world, initially accepted only among elites. Their adoption faced cultural and technical barriers, but eventually contributed to changes in domestic hygiene practices. Despite advances, old habits persisted widely, especially outside urban centers. Through the 18th and 19th centuries, rapid industrialization transformed societies, yet many personal care practices remained traditional or improvised. Newspapers and cloths were commonly repurposed materials in daily life. Rural communities often retained long-standing customs adapted to local resources. Scientific advances gradually influenced public health policies, promoting cleanliness as essential to well-being. Marketing and education encouraged new products, but acceptance varied across cultures and regions. The story of hygiene reflects broader social, cultural, and technological changes, intertwining private life with public health, tradition with innovation, and individual habits with societal norms. Corn cobs, smoothed and dried, remained common in frontier regions, and as settlers pushed westward, they brought their wiping habits with them. In farmhouses from Ohio to the Dakotas, a corn cob might sit beside a wooden privy bench, shared by the household, rinsed occasionally but rarely discarded. Yet something began to change in 1857. Joseph Gaiety, a New York entrepreneur, introduced the first commercial toilet paper. Packaged in flat sheets, infused with aloe, and marketed as a medical product, Gaiety's medicated paper was intended to prevent hemorrhoids and soothe sensitive areas. But despite his vision, the product was slow to catch on. Most Americans still viewed wiping as something that didn't require a specialized product. Why pay for something you could tear out of a catalog? Ironically, the Sears Roebuck catalog itself became one of the most popular wiping tools in American outhouses. So much so that when the company began printing on glossy paper in the 1930s, customers complained not about the content, but the wipe. Across the Atlantic, Europeans were also wrestling with change. In Paris, the rise of public toilets, pissoirs, and coin-operated stalls meant that wiping had to become more standardized. Small rolls of thin tissue began appearing, often issued in public facilities, but they were coarse, flimsy, and far from luxurious. Most people still relied on handkerchiefs or cloths they could wash. In Germany, where engineering and hygiene had long shared a tight embrace, innovations in paper production made toilet tissue more affordable. Factories that once produced newsprint or packaging began to test softer pulps. By the late 19th century, the first perforated rolls appeared, but they were marketed as novelty items, humorous, even suspicious. Some clergy denounced the very idea of spending money on wiping. It was, to them, yet another symbol of unnecessary excess. At the same time, Japan had been quietly cultivating its own wiping philosophy. Long before Western paper reached its shores, the Japanese used chugi, thin, flat sticks made of bamboo or wood to clean themselves after using squat toilets. The method was effective, if not gentle, and often followed by rinsing with water. But during the Edo period, the increasing availability of paper, especially washi, the soft handmade paper crafted from mulberry bark, allowed for a more comfortable experience. Unlike in the West, wiping in Japan was a ritualized act linked to purity and care. The paper was folded with attention. The sticks were cleaned with ash and oil. And the act was taught, not hidden. By contrast, in Victorian Europe and America, the subject of wiping remained taboo. Children were rarely taught how to clean themselves well. Instructions were whispered or implied. Hygiene was not discussed at the table. And yet, the consequences were everywhere. Soiled sheets, rashes, infections. Medical journals of the period noted the rise of ailments directly linked to poor wiping habits. But still, the silence persisted. It was as if acknowledging the act made one indecent. This divide between the visibility of innovation and the invisibility of defecation would continue to shape the future. As sewer systems grew beneath cities and waste disappeared with a pull of the chain, wiping remained a private burden. The materials changed slowly, reluctantly, and always with resistance. And even in households that adopted commercial toilet paper, it was often reserved for guests. The family used rags, or nothing. But the wheels of capitalism had started turning. Advertisements for hygiene products began to appear in women's magazines. Doctors were paid to endorse sanitary papers. Slowly, the idea that wiping deserved its own product began to settle in the public mind. But true acceptance would not come until the 20th century. For now, in this transitional chapter of history, people wiped with whatever they could find. But they also began to ask, could there be a better way, a cleaner way, a more dignified way? That question would soon change everything. But first, it would take war, marketing, and shame. And those, too, were just beginning. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the landscape of human hygiene was poised on the edge of transformation. The world was becoming more connected through railways, telegraphs, and oceanic cables, and with that connectivity came the rapid exchange not just of goods and ideas, but of expectations. Cleanliness, once a private ritual or a religious obligation, was now increasingly framed as a social duty. To be unclean was no longer just uncomfortable. It was undesirable, impolite, even shameful. In this shifting world, wiping slowly emerged from behind the curtain of taboo, not because the act changed, but because its implications did. It was now tied to self-respect, to public health, and to the modern ideal of progress. In Europe, particularly in the industrial cities of Germany, France, and Britain, advertisements began to feature softly illustrated scenes of women delicately handling embossed rolls of toilet paper, surrounded by lace and floral motifs. These were not just products, they were aspirations. By 1890, the Scott Paper Company in America had begun selling toilet paper on rolls, an innovation in form that would eventually define the entire industry. Yet even as these products gained popularity, many households remained skeptical. The older generations clung to cloth rags, homemade alternatives, or simply water. The resistance wasn't just about cost, it was about culture. Buying toilet paper meant admitting that the body required such attention. For some, that was too much to admit aloud. Meanwhile, in places like India, where water had always been the dominant mode of post-defecation cleaning, the Western insistence on dry wiping seemed not just foreign, but ineffective. In Muslim-majority regions, including North Africa and the Middle East, water had long been preferred for both hygienic and religious reasons. The introduction of commercial toilet paper in these regions was slow and often unwelcome. And in Japan, where cleanliness was deeply ingrained in daily life, paper was used but followed often religiously by thorough washing. As cities expanded, sanitation departments grew in influence. Public health campaigns started to mention wiping indirectly under the guise of personal cleanliness. Leaflets distributed in schools began teaching children how to wash their hands after using the toilet, and though wiping was rarely addressed explicitly, the implication was clear. There was a right way and a wrong way. In America, the years surrounding World War I saw a massive surge in the production of hygiene products. Soldiers returning from Europe brought back not just stories, but new routines. The field latrine, grim and basic, still required wiping, and when paper was supplied, it became a quiet standard. Those soldiers returned home and raised children who grew up with a roll on the wall. Slowly, silently, normalcy formed. Yet wiping still carried no consistent script. One household used squares of old sheets. Another bought rolls only for company. Some still relied on catalogs, their pages thinned by use. And many children learned the process not from parents, but through whispered guidance from older siblings. Toilet paper itself was evolving. The texture changed, the softness improved, the price dropped, and the brands multiplied. By the 1930s, names like Northern, Charmin, and Quilted had entered the marketplace, often with mascots or jingles designed to ease the discomfort of speaking about wiping. Humor became a key tool in advertising. Bears in forests, gentle jokes about softness, euphemisms that danced around the reality but invited you to laugh. By softening the language, society softened the discomfort. It wasn't just about selling paper. It was about rewriting the narrative. Still, there were obstacles. Public restrooms often offered no toilet paper at all. Factories and schools expected individuals to provide their own. And in poorer regions, wiping remained a function of resourcefulness. A scrap of cloth, a smooth stone, a handful of leaves. At the same time, the plumbing infrastructure of major cities had begun to standardize, leading to new problems. Clogged pipes from improper materials. Municipal guidelines were issued. Use only approved paper. Do not flush cloth. The system, both cultural and mechanical, was tightening its grip. The language of wiping began to appear in books, not in literature, but in medical texts, etiquette manuals, and eventually in the fine print of advertisements. For the first time, wiping was discussed without shame. Not openly, but not invisibly either. Schools began to incorporate basic hygiene into health classes, hospitals issued pamphlets, magazines ran columns on modern bathroom essentials. The private act became part of the public conversation, albeit in hushed tones. And all the while, the world edged closer to war. World War II, looming on the horizon, would once again accelerate the transformation of hygiene. But in this moment, this strange interwar period, the world was poised between two ages, the age of improvisation and the age of standardization. Wiping had come far, from corncobs and moss to perforated rolls. But even now, it remained a quiet ritual shaped by geography, class, and culture. The question was no longer whether people wiped, it was how. And soon, the answer would be rewritten by industry, media, and global conflict. The 20th century did not merely advance hygiene, it industrialized it. As the new century dawned, a subtle shift took place. What once had been whispered about behind doors and handled with improvisation became streamlined, mass-produced, and standardized. The private act of wiping, which had traveled through centuries of leaves, shells, cloths, and newspaper, was now entering the era of consumer culture. The humble roll of toilet paper, once an expensive oddity, was now a fixture, though not yet universal. In America, the 1920s brought mass marketing and soft branding. Toilet paper was no longer just toilet paper. It was gentle, hygienic, modern. Words like comfort and purity appeared on the packaging. Charmin introduced cartoon bears. Northern emphasized softness. The goal wasn't just to sell a product, it was to sell a feeling, to remove the shame that still lingered around this most human of acts. By mid-century, wiping was fully embedded in the capitalist rhythm of the modern household. It was a ritual performed multiple times a day, taught to children, advertised on radio, and eventually television. Yet even as it spread, it remained stubbornly invisible in polite conversation. There was still no proper word for what one did in the bathroom. Euphemisms multiplied. Go number 2. Freshen up. Visit the little room. And while people joked about toilet paper shortages or embarrassing moments, the underlying discomfort persisted. Meanwhile, the world beyond the West told a different story. In much of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, wiping remained a wet affair. Water, not paper, was king. And, in many cases, this method was considered superior, not just for cleanliness, but for religious and cultural reasons. In India, the use of a lota, a small water vessel, remained standard. In Muslim countries, ablution after relieving oneself was a religious obligation. Even as globalization brought toilet paper into supermarkets, local customs held firm. And in many rural areas, improvised wiping methods remained in place. Coconut husks, smooth stones, cloth scraps, or even the left hand, followed by rigorous washing. As globalization accelerated, so too did a silent war of norms. International hotels began offering both options paper and water. Airports introduced bidet attachments. And slowly, what was once seen as a Western standard began to fragment. The rise of the bidet, particularly in Japan, introduced a new layer of complexity. The Japanese washlet, developed in the 1980s, combined technology with hygiene, offering heated seats, cleansing sprays, and even air drying. For many in Japan, this wasn't luxury, it was basic human dignity. And yet, in places like the United States, the bidet was treated as exotic or unnecessary. The divide was not just technological, it was philosophical. Do we wipe ourselves clean, or do we wash? Is hygiene a tactile act, or one of water and ritual? The 20th century did not resolve this. It amplified the debate. Marketing campaigns exploded. Some paper brands emphasized strength, no tears, no mess. Others promised feather-like softness. The messaging was clear. This product made you better, cleaner, more modern. But few stopped to ask, was wiping with paper truly better? Environmentally, the cost was rising. Millions of trees cut annually, billions of gallons of water used in processing, chemical bleaching, packaging waste. And yet, for most consumers, the role remained invisible, an item of convenience, never questioned. Schools continued to educate about hygiene, but the wiping process remained strangely absent from official discourse. Parents passed down their own routines. Some used wet wipes, others insisted on folding squares precisely. A few whispered about switching to bidets, but it remained personal, deeply private. And then came moments of reckoning. The oil crises of the 1970s reminded the world how fragile global supply chains were. Suddenly, even toilet paper became scarce in some places. People panicked, hoarded. Newspapers ran headlines about shortages. Comedians joked. But underneath the humor was a raw anxiety. What if the most basic comfort of modern life disappeared? The event passed, but the memory lingered. And it would echo again, decades later, when the COVID-19 pandemic erupted. Once more, toilet paper flew off shelves. Once more, society laughed nervously. But it wasn't funny. It was a mirror. A reminder of how fragile even the most mundane modern systems truly are. In hospitals, public buildings, and prisons, new protocols emerged. Some institutions switched to dispensers that rationed squares. Others adopted flushable wet wipes, only to discover they clogged sewer systems and sparked municipal crises. Wiping had become a public problem. Cities began to pass laws about what could and could not be flushed. Environmental groups sounded alarms. And quietly, consumers began to ask, is this really the best we can do? A movement started small at first. Zero waste advocates promoted reusable cloths. Environmentalists championed bidets. Health experts raised questions about bacteria, irritation, and the hidden cost of scented toilet papers. But industry pushed back. Advertising grew louder. Product lines diversified. Aloe, infused, hypoallergenic, bamboo-based. The paper war continued. Softness versus sustainability, convenience versus conscience, and through it all, one truth remained. Wiping, that most intimate act, had come to reflect the values of an entire civilization. What we chose to use, how we disposed of it, whether we spoke of it, all of it was a mirror of our wealth, our shame, our priorities. The story wasn't over. It never had been. And as the century drew to a close, new forces waited just around the bend. Climate anxiety, rising populations, technological disruption. The question remained, what would wiping become next? The 21st century arrived not with thunder, but with quiet anxiety. A new millennium, full of promises, began with the weight of global tension, economic shifts, and environmental reckoning. Amid technological leaps, smartphones, AI, and space exploration, humanity continued its ancient daily ritual, wiping. But now, for the first time in history, people began to truly question it. The toilet paper aisle no longer felt neutral. Environmental reports painted sobering pictures. Each roll of paper represented energy, water, trees. The bleaching process polluted rivers. The packaging contributed to plastic waste. And all of it, used for seconds, flushed away. The idea that this was the best solution began to crack. Enter the age of disruption. In major cities, startup culture collided with hygiene. Innovative bidets with sleek designs and warm water jets flooded the market. No plumbing changes required. Easy installation. Eco-friendly. Suddenly, influencers and minimalists posted reviews. Tech bloggers endorsed washlets. The idea of washing, long viewed in the West as foreign or fussy, began to feel modern, and for many, liberating. Advertisements changed tone. Instead of cartoon bears promising softness, there were now clean, white, minimalist videos, bidet brands promising dignity, cleanliness, and sustainability. "Why are you still wiping?" asked one ad provocatively. The question was no longer taboo. It was trending. Yet adoption wasn't universal. Millions still relied on traditional paper. Some clung to the familiar folding, wiping, flushing without reflection. Others distrusted water-based methods, fearing leaks or cold sprays. Plumbing systems weren't always compatible. Some rural areas had no interest in change, but the movement was growing. Meanwhile, wet wipes had their moment. Once reserved for babies, they entered adult bathrooms quietly. Marketed as refreshing, travel-friendly, and discreet, they offered a cleaner feeling. But quickly, their hidden costs surfaced. Sewer systems worldwide reported catastrophic blockages. Fatberg's massive clogs formed by wipes, grease, and waste were unearthed from city pipes. Municipalities spent millions removing them. Campaigns warned, "Don't flush wipes." But confusion persisted. Labels read flushable. Reality said otherwise. Environmentalists sounded the alarm. What began as a convenience had become a crisis. People took sides: paper purists, bidet enthusiasts, cloth advocates. A hygiene war was brewing. At the same time, cultural conversations deepened. Public discourse began to explore how toilet habits revealed privilege. In refugee camps and underserved areas, toilet paper was a luxury. In some prisons, it was rationed. In schools, students joked about single-ply horrors, but behind the humor were systemic failures. Wiping became political. Health researchers joined the debate. Doctors discussed irritation, hemorrhoids, infections. Wiping, they argued, wasn't always gentle. In fact, it often did more harm than good. Bidets reduced medical issues. Water cleaned better. The science was clear, but old habits held firm. And then came COVID-19. A virus reshaped the world, and with it, the way people viewed everything, including hygiene. Toilet paper vanished from shelves. Panic buying, hoarding, photos of empty aisles circled the globe. Memes exploded. People joked. But anxiety simmered. For many, it was their first true realization that the supply chain was fragile, that the ritual they performed every day relied on an invisible global infrastructure, and it could disappear overnight. The crisis pushed people to adapt. Some bought bidets. Others resorted to cloth. A few turned to historical methods: newspapers, leaves, even corn cobs, rediscovered as a strange echo from the past. Online forums lit up with guides. How to wipe without toilet paper. It was no longer history, it was now. After the panic settled, reflection began. Why did something so basic feel so precarious? Why did wiping still carry shame? A new wave of thinkers approached the topic with boldness. Designers imagined the bathrooms of the future. Smart toilets that analyzed health through waste, auto-washing, self-drying, even scent control. Biodegradable materials. Composting toilets for urban use. Waterless systems for drought regions. Hygiene, once silent, became a frontier for innovation. And slowly, people spoke up. Articles appeared in major outlets. Podcasts explored the anthropology of wiping. Teachers introduced toilet education in schools, not just potty training, but global perspectives on hygiene. Artists, too, contributed. Installations, performances, even poems. Wiping was no longer unspeakable. It was human, essential, and worth examining. In homes, conversations changed. Parents asked children how they felt about different methods. Travelers compared systems abroad. Elderly people, once ashamed of switching to bidets for mobility, now proudly recommended them. Culture shifted. But still, not everyone could change. In many parts of the world, access to sanitation remained a dream. Millions lived without clean water, without toilets, without any safe way to manage waste. For them, wiping wasn't a debate, it was survival. The 21st century had brought luxury and scarcity closer together than ever before. It asked uncomfortable questions. What is dignity? Is wiping a right? Is cleanliness a privilege? And do we owe it to others, not just ourselves, to rethink what we flush, what we waste, and what we ignore? The story wasn't over. The paper hadn't run out. But the cracks in the ritual were visible. The 21st century promised answers. But first, it demanded that we look not away, but directly into the mirror, and ask, what do we truly leave behind when we wipe? So here we are, Thousands of years since the first human crouched in a quiet forest, looked down at what nature had left behind, and reached for the nearest leaf. Since the first wet clay scraped from stone, since the first woven rag, the first sand-smoothed pebble, the first cold splash of water from a mountain stream, we began with instinct, we moved with need, and all the while, we wiped. From Assyrian tablets to Roman sponges, from Chinese bamboo paper to French lace, from Japanese washi to New York subway ads promising ultra-soft 3-ply solutions, we've wiped through every era. Through famine and feast, through plagues and empires, through golden ages and dark ones, through global wars and quiet evenings. Every king, every peasant, every philosopher and child, every monk, merchant, prisoner, and queen at some point, they all did it. Quietly, thoughtlessly, or in moments of discomfort, with curiosity and shame. It was always there, the body doing what it must, and the hands tasked with what followed. We've seen how the methods changed, how cloth gave way to paper, how water returned, how industry shaped preferences, how advertising taught generations what clean meant, how waste management became invisible, how comfort was promised but not always delivered, and how behind it all lay a deeper truth, how we care for ourselves when no one's watching. But this story isn't just about toilet paper. It never was. It's about dignity, about ritual, about the things we inherit without question. And sometimes, about the quiet courage it takes to ask why. Why do we fold instead of crumple? Why do we choose one texture over another? Why are some methods seen as civilized and others ridiculed? Who decides? Why do some wipe in silence, while others teach their children with songs and stories? Why is something so deeply human treated as if it's shameful? Maybe because it reminds us every day that we're mortal, that we have bodies, that we're soft, vulnerable, imperfect, that no matter how powerful, how successful, how wise we still squat, we still wipe. And maybe that's the most grounding thought of all. In a world filled with ego and illusion, wiping humbles us. It connects us across time, across culture, across belief. It reminds us that no one escapes the small tasks, the necessary ones, the ones that don't win awards, that aren't written into history books, but that make up so much of our lives. And perhaps in those moments when we tear the paper, turn on the bidet, reach for the cloth, we're closer to every human who came before us than in any battle, any speech, any monument. Perhaps this simple act is where history breathes, softly. Now, in the dark stillness of your room, let the noise fade. The questions can wait. The answers are slow. You've walked through time tonight, through reeds and rags, silk and steam, ash and linen, through crowded castles and quiet monasteries, through chambers and stalls, through embarrassment and innovation, through laughter, disgust, ingenuity, and necessity. And now you're here, in the present. Clean, tired, still. Let your body rest. Let the lights dim behind your eyes. You've learned more than most will ever ask about what it means to be human, about what it means to care, not just for the world, but for yourself. The story ends not with a flush, but with a sigh, not with a joke, but with understanding. And in that silence, in that gentle pause, history waits to be remembered, and to remind us that sometimes the quietest things carry the loudest truth. Good night.